Shortening coat sleeves can be confusing, but if you do it step by step and neatly, you can do a nice job and save a lot of money. This works for suit coats, some women's coats, and some overcoats. The first thing we need to do is get the coat buttons off of the sleeve, and to do it very carefully, because sometimes the position where the buttons are now sewn will show after the alteration is completed. So one thread at a time if need be. Get them off. An inch or so above the lower edge of the exterior of the coat, the lining is sewn to the exterior, usually with stitching that doesn't go all the way through. Almost always that's the case. So next we release that stitching. It may be one long chain stitched piece that will pull out, and it may not. Different manufacturers do it differently. But do it gently so as not to create any pulls in the lining fabric. When you've freed the lining, push it up the sleeve and out of the way, and with the sleeve inside out, here is what is usually left. There is a strand of stitching holding the hem to the outer part of the garment that just barely catches the stitches on the outer layer, and we need to release that as well. Sometimes there's no stitching. It may be done with a bonding fabric, or the lower edge of the sleeve may be secured entirely by tacking along the seams of the lining and with the positioning of the buttons, which is how I'm going to put it back, though I will cue you when you could baste the layers together. The pin is marking the new sleeve length that we want, and you can see there's stitching in the way that must be released in order for us to start shortening. Get rid of all the stitching that holds that vent into place. Really, it's a mock vent. It doesn't really open and shut with the buttons, but we need to get all of it out of the way so that we can then release the seams that go up from the fold line and create new ones so as to make our coat sleeves the right length, right up to there. Once that stitching that's up the folds at the sides of the vents is released, we need to recreate the same kind of thing at the new and shorter level. Again, being very gentle, because suit fabrics are quite delicate and fray easily, open the seams that run towards the fold at the bottom of the coat sleeve. The two sides of the same vent may not be constructed exactly the same. That's okay, release them both, and be aware that there may be some interior tacking. Right there is a piece of it that also has to be released all the way to the fold, and then pick out all those fuzzy little threads, annoying as they are. Now at the top of the vent opening, we need to open enough more of the seam that we can fold to the new length and tuck our edges in and fold them neatly down. So we're going to need considerably more room than is offered just by releasing the original vent. If only shortening maybe a half an inch, it's okay to leave the excess fabric. But in this case, I'm shortening about 2 inches, and that's just way too much extra. So I'm trimming it off, and you must too. But keep one hand under so the scissors run across the top of your hand, and you know for certain that you are not catching the outer layer of the suit fabric in your confusion and accidentally trimming it off. Almost always there's enough interfacing left to continue to give shape and form to the new bottom edge, and we won't have to add any. Manufacturers are pretty generous with the span of interfacing, and you can see here that the new fold will be properly supported with what's left. Next, place the pin right where the new edge needs to fold, near the corner of each side of the vent. Turn it up, pin it in position, and make extra sure that they still match when they overlap. It can surprise you, and if you need to adjust one so that they'll overlap and line up properly, do that. In my experience, even though they were probably machine sewn to begin with, the best way to make the new vent edges seamed shut is to do it by hand. It's very little sewing. At the manufacturing plant, the suit wasn't finished when this happened, so they could twist and turn the fabric with great ease. We cannot, and I've done it both ways, but it does get confusing inside this coat sleeve. And it's such a tiny amount of sewing that you need to do that you can do what you see here. Tiny stitches and the overlap of that vent edge towards the inside is folded at a slight diagonal so that it will never show on the outside. Only a folded edge of the main fabric will. And in this way you can get a nice tidy edge that creases well after it's pressed and closely resembles the original, but you don't risk getting a failure of alignment from things shifting around while you have the sleeve inside out and upside down. Be very particular about snipping all thread ends. It's the difference between a professional looking job and a raggedy looking one, no matter how nice your sewing is. Check the position that the bottom button will fall into, making it the same as the buttons were originally positioned with reference to the sleeve, the bottom button that is. Underneath where that button is going to fall, you can tack all the layers together to prevent them from shifting, which will keep the vent neat. If you want to run an invisible line of stitching joining the folded under hem to the outer fabric, this is the time to do it. Just barely catch that outer layer with loose stitches. At this point, you can put all the buttons back on before attaching the lining if you want to. Some manufacturers sew the buttons through the lining as part of what keeps the lining positioned. Some do not. Some have sewn them on previously to finishing the lining. You may do either. I normally do sew through the lining because it is such a good way to keep that lining from sagging, which is a common problem. With only occasional exceptions, the buttons are lined up along the edge of the vent, almost touching one another. So once you've positioned that first button, you're in good shape. Use small blind stitches and do not catch the outer layer of the fabric. When positioning the lining, make sure that it is not twisted and don't pull it completely tightly. Generally, there is a little bit of length ease left in the lining to make sure the outer part of the sleeve hangs freely. What you see me doing now is optional, but I think it keeps the sleeve hem neater for a long time, and that is to sew the inner layer of the vent down to the rest of the fabric. It can't be seen from the outside, but it helps keep everything aligned beautifully. Knot the thread and then push the needle between the two layers of fabric for an inch or more. Pull it up a little, and that way when you snip, the end of the snipped thread disappears between the layers. Check to make sure that the lining is sitting smoothly where you put it. No stitches are showing through on the outside. And then where the pin is going in, you can tack straight through the seam as an additional way to prevent lining sag. Make sure that tacking stitch is completely centered in the ditch of the seam to keep it hidden, and don't make it overly tight. Now is a good time to press the entire new lower edge of the sleeve with a damp pressing cloth. Now sew the line of buttons the same distance as they were originally from the lower edge of the sleeve. If you're sewing through the lining, make sure it doesn't get twisted as the buttons are applied. Now it's securely in place with a little bit of lengthwise ease. Do one final pressing, avoiding the button area, and it'll look good as new.